All right, so we are ready for the next speaker. Our next speaker is Joel Orwin, and he's gonna talk about group key agreement, not just group key agreement, but continuous group key agreement, resilient against forks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is joint work with Marta and Yanis. All right. So, okay, a good place to start. Quick reminder, what is CGK in the first place? CGK is a protocol that allows a dynamic group of parties to asynchronously agree on a sequence of shared group keys. Dynamic group here means parties can join and leave mid-session. Asynchronous means the protocol has to be non-interactive. So CGK is pretty well studied at this point in academia. We've got a whole bunch of constructions. Recently, it's also made it into practice in the form of the implicit CGK and the messaging layer security protocol. That's just been released by the IETF. So CGK sessions evolve in epochs. Within an epoch, the state of the CGK is fixed. Okay, membership is fixed. There's a group key known to all members. It's all fixed. Any change to this state gives rise to a new epoch in the lifetime of the CGK session. For example, Alice will create a group that's epoch 1 with Bob in it. Then she'll make Bob a moderator. That's epoch 2 with a new group key K2. And then she'll leave and Charlie will join. That's epoch 3, and so on and so forth. So the security that we expect from CGK covers 3 intuitive properties: privacy, authenticity, and agreement. Privacy here means that keys should be distinguished from random in a pretty strong sort of CCA flavored sense. Authenticity also quite strong. And agreement states that group members will not agree on the group key unless they also agree on the entire group state. In particular, that includes the history of the group. We'll come back to it. So the concrete flavor of these 3 properties that are captured in the security follows this PCFS paradigm, post-compromise forward secrecy. And this is inspired by the fact that these sessions are expected to last a long time, maybe years. And so you need to be able to recover. These sessions have to be able to recover from compromises. So in the case of privacy, you can think of the intuitive statement that you're getting here is that today's group keys look random despite both past and future compromises of group members. So in other words, the protocols are constantly healing themselves. Under the hood, there's been rekeying of fresh entropy being injected all the time. Okay, this brings us to forks. So you can think of a fork as a distributed session state in which 2 or more parties, their local views disagree on the history of the session. Right? So in this case, we've got Alice and Bob who disagree on what the successor epoch to E should be. Alice thinks it's EA, Bob thinks it's EB. Okay, so this is a fork. And you know, forks can come about, of course, if the adversary controls the network, they can partition the network and stuff like that, and that can give rise to forks. Unfortunately, in practice, there's a whole host of much more benign and also more common reasons that can lead to forks. Maybe links go down in your network, or you have race conditions in your delivery server, things like that. And so these things really happen, and this is aggravated by the fact that these protocols are asynchronous. So creating a new epoch is really nothing more than constructing a particular protocol message and sending it out, and that's it. There's no round of interactions that let you synchronize with other protocols. But where things really start to get hairy is when you think about how forks interact with agreement. By definition of a fork, parties don't agree on the history. By definition of an agreement, that means they don't agree on the group key. So being in a fork means communication just breaks down. And the real problem here is if you look at how current constructions for CGK enforce forward secrecy, because they do so in a way that's quite heavy-handed. And the consequence of how they do it is that you can never actually go back to a previous epoch you were in and process some other message. So once you reach epoch EA, you'll never be able to go back and process the message that leads to epoch EB. So in other words, once you're forked forever. There's no reconciling that in the session. So these observations motivated us to introduce this notion of fork resilient CGK. And this is basically a bog standard CGK, right? No compromise on privacy and functionality here. But with the added functionality that you can process incoming messages out of order. Okay, let's temper that for a moment. We don't need any order. We just need causality respecting orders. So, okay, you'll get the guarantee you will never see an epoch before you've seen all of its predecessor epochs. In this case, maybe you'll see EA first, maybe you see EAB first, but you'll never see EA before you see E. Okay? So what we want is a CGK that lets you process messages in any causality respect. That's our goal. All right, fortunately, this is positive results, and we have some constructions. And to see how these constructions work, it's instructive to look at how existing constructions fail. What goes wrong? And by and large, they all follow this same paradigm, which in this talk I'll call the evolving entropy fluid paradigm. In fact, this is so general, it actually also applies to the double ratchet and some other two-party academic ratcheting protocols. But anyway, we're sticking to CGK. The central object in this paradigm is an entropy. Concretely, think like it's a 32-byte value. And we use it to accumulate entropy. And everybody in a given epoch has the current value for this entropy pool. And the only thing you ever do with this entropy pool is one kind of operation. You absorb fresh entropy into it, you extract a current group key K, and you get an updated state of your entropy. So this gives us a natural way to construct CGK. You're in epoch I minus 1. You want to construct a new epoch. So what do? You sample some fresh randomness, you distribute this randomness R, you distribute it privately to the group, and now everybody in the group is going to absorb it into the old entropy pool, extract out a new group key, and a new state. All right, so far so good. And now we have to ask ourselves, well, how are we going to get forward secrecy? Okay, so there's two natural options that kind of present themselves. Suppose Bob gets corrupted in epoch I. In epoch I, we want to guarantee that the key Ki he output remains forward secret. So there's really two things you can do here. One is you make sure that the corruption doesn't leak too much about the old entropy pool, so the adversary cannot evaluate the extract and absorb, or the corruption doesn't leak too much about R. One or the other is good enough. And up till now, all the constructions, they really focus on this first approach, but they do it very heavy-handed. They basically stipulate as soon as you compute this new entropy pool PI, you have to go back and you delete the old one completely. And the upshot of that is, if you now get some delayed RI prime, you can no longer evaluate the absorb and extract because you've deleted that old entropy. And this is why you're forked for it. So with that in mind, the natural thought here is, well, let's be more fine-grained about what we delete. Right? And we have primitives there, namely a punctuable PRF. A punctuable pseudo-random function, which is a PRF where you can take a key and you can puncture at a certain point, and the resulting punctured key allows you to still evaluate the PRF everywhere else, but not at that one. So, okay, let's reinterpret our entropy pool as a PPRF key. And we're going to mix it with the new entropy R by evaluating the PRF at R, and then we're going to puncture the PPRF key at R. Looks like it fixed the problem, right? I mean, now if you leak a punctured point, you're not going to be able to evaluate the PPRF at this RI. Unfortunately, there's still a problem because in general, punctured PPRF keys can leak the points at which they were punctured. And indeed, in this construction, we're puncturing at a pretty sensitive point, this fresh entropy we're injecting. And this really does lead to quite severe attacks on this kind of construction. For example, you corrupt Alice in epoch I minus 1. You learn the entire PPRF key because she hasn't done anything with it. She hasn't punctured it. Now she creates a new epoch, and it goes on to another epoch I plus 1, and so on and so forth. And eventually you go and corrupt her again. Now you look at the PPRF key from that first epoch. She's punctured at RI. So now we can just read out RI, and in combination of what we learned in that first corruption, we have everything we need to compute the key KI. So although we didn't corrupt anybody there, we corrupted before and after, and we can still attack the key KI. So this isn't going to be. We need another idea, and what we're going to do is we introduce a challenge. So along with RI, we want to create a new epoch, you also distribute a random challenge C. And that's the point where we evaluate the PPRF. So it's no longer a sensitive point. So it does actually address this BCFS attack. Unfortunately, there's still a bit of a kind of little hitch here, which is what we would call, what I would call challenge burning denial of service attacks. Okay, so this is a setting where you have an adversary in the group. Okay, we've given up on privacy. But now Alice, who's honest, constructs a new epoch with some challenge C. The adversary sees this, quickly constructs their own new epoch, but recycles the challenge C, delivers. So now the honest users, when they eventually do get Alice's message, they've already punctured at C, so they can no longer process honest Alice's message. Fortunately, there's a pretty clean and efficient fix to this with no added cost. Instead of letting the challenge be chosen willy-nilly, we're going to say that stipulate the challenge essentially is given by a fingerprint of everything we care about, all the characteristics we care about the new epoch we're trying to construct. How does this address the problem? Well, think about it. If the adversary wants to reuse this challenge from Alice, well, his hands are tied. He's going to have to reuse everything about the epoch. So he's just going to create the exact same epoch. So this is indeed what the core of our first construction, the protocol we call Freak, based on SAKE, which in turn is based on MLS. So this is a truly practical protocol. In applied crypto sense, this is the result I would say you should focus on. It's efficient. It's as efficient as SAKE, which is more efficient than MLS. It only uses standard crypto primitives that you'll find in any off-the-shelf crypto lib. There's no compromise on security. It's on par with MLS and SAKE. But of course, the point, it's also for preservation. So this is part of the applied main research. But, you know, we're theoreticians, and so we can ask, well, hey, can we do better? And that leads us to say, well, what about optimal security? Optimal security here means anything that is implied by correctness, okay, you got to let the adversary do that, but nothing new. If Alice can decrypt a message from Bob and the adversary corrects Alice, oh, okay, fine, the adversary can also decrypt the message from Bob, but that's it. And it turns out that, well, Freak, like MLS, like SAKE, is not optimal. There are non-trivial collusion attacks that you can corrupt multiple times at the right time with certain executions. And you can combine the information you learn from the different parties to do non-trivial things that none of them could do on their own. Okay, so new quest. Optimally secure FR CGK. So we're going to go back to that previous fork in the road we had, and we're going to branch off in the other directions. Instead of trying to implement forward secrecy by deleting what we can about the entropy field, we'll try and make sure that corruptions don't leak past information about past new entropy up. But what we really want is some way, some fine-grained forward secret way of encrypting R to the group. We have to distribute this quite actively. Now, it turns out for the healing, remember these protocols are always healing. One of the key properties we need is that if Alice encrypts R to the group, she's the only one in the group who can not actually encrypt them. And so, okay, we'll need some public key encryption. So far, so good. In fact, this is exactly pretty much what MLS does, what SAKE does, what Freak does. They use public key encryption. Of course, that's not very forward secure because you're going to keep the decryption key around for other values that you need in the future. So this has been looked at before, and even in the context of CGK. And ACD T19, they introduced using updatable public key encryption, which is sort of a form of a poor man's forward secret public key encryption. And they constructed a CGK with that, and it was indeed had better forward secrecy problems. But as noted in another work, ACGN 19, it's still not optimal because you have certain kinds of collusion attacks where you corrupt people in a fork. Now you can combine those states to do more. So still not optimally secure. And that's why in that work, they switched over to using Hive as the public key primitive. Hive, for those of you that don't know, it's like identity-based encryption where your public key is an arbitrary string, like an email. But instead of just one string in Hive, it's a whole vector of strings. And the salient property of Hive is if you have the secret key for some vector v, you can easily derive the secret key for any larger vector v prime that begins with. Right? So they use Hive in a pretty sneaky way. Right? When you distribute R, when you encrypt it to a particular address, the Hive identity you're going to use is given by the history that led to the secret. So every epoch has its own hive identity. And the key security property of hive is that there's no non-trivial combinations of secret keys you can do. If you have a collection of hive secret keys, the only things you can do are things you could have done with one of those secret keys on its own. You can't merge them to do new things. And it turns out that's exactly what you need for optimal security. So their protocol is, in fact, an optimally secure CGK. But is it fine-grained? No, it's not. Because they still implement failed secrecy in much the same way. Once you transition to a new epoch, you have to delete the hive secret key for the old epoch. So once again, you're stuck. You cannot decrypt any other R primes that come your way. So really what we need is some form of puncturable. It's for the purpose of this talk. I call this a puncturable hive. So it's a hive like the one they have. Each coordinate is a k-bit string so that you can encode the history that led you to this epoch. But in addition, you can puncture secret keys. Namely, the secret key for a depth D identity can be punctured at some D plus first coordinate. It's in the next coordinate. And we want three things from this puncture. First, forward secrecy, where we want to make sure that you can no longer decrypt at ID plus one. So the second thing you want is just for correctness, right? You want to be able to keep going to the next and the next and the next epoch, which means you need to be able to, with this punctured key, be able to derive any descendant of it. So although you can't decrypt at ID plus C, you can still derive the key to ID plus C prime. Right? You can keep going down. And for fork resilience, you need to be able to derive siblings, right? So any ID plus C prime where C prime is different. So those are the three properties we need in this function. And sanity check, yes, it's public key encryption, it's fine-grained forward secret, and it's cross-fork resilient, attack resilient, just like the ACGM. It's for the same reason. They're encoding the identities and using encoding the history and the identity and using. So this is kind of the core technique, one of the two core techniques that underlie our second protocol, our second construction of OFRIC for optimal. Yeah. So I'm gonna, for the last part, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about how we construct this function. We're gonna do that using a primitive called binary tree encryption, which is just a hive, with the only restriction that each coordinate in your identity vector is just one bit. And so the identity to the tree, the identity hierarchy is like binary tree, massive binary tree. Okay, so our P hive is effectively going to be constructed out of a single instance of the BTE, which is great, it's simple. And the only thing we really need to do is assign every P hive identity its own BTE identities that represents this P hive identity. So if you want to encrypt to that P hive identity, you're really just going to encrypt the BTE identity that was assigned to it. So we do that, and then we got to find a way to function. So okay, let's see how we can assign these identities. We're going to start with the empty vector. And that's easy. The empty vector for P hive gets assigned the empty vector for the BTE. Super straightforward. So let's say, we've done all the depth D P hive identities. Each one of them has been assigned its own BTE identity. Fix one ID. We want to find a way to assign each of its children, ID plus some C, their own BTE identities. Okay, so in this case, ID in the picture, your ID would be epsilon, would be empty. What do? We look at the depth K tree that is attached to the, say, always the right child of the ID BTE. Okay? And notice it's depth K, right? So it's got two of the K units, which means every leaf we can assign to one possible next coordinate, ID plus C, right? Every C will have its own leaf in this depth K tree. And so that's how we assign the BTE nodes. The P identity ID with I as the next coordinate is assigned in ith leaf in this tree. So recursing this, we've now assigned every possible P hive identity its own BTE identity. So good, that's the construction as far as assigning these identities. So the only thing that's left is really to see how we can puncture these things. How can we puncture these things? So, okay, what do we have to do? What's the problem here? Well, we've got some P hive identity. We want to puncture it with some next coordinates. So the first thing we do is we find the BTE identity assigned to this P hive identity. Let's call it ID star. It's denoted in purple. So that's a particular node in this tree. And the protocol ensures that you only ever have to do this puncturing when you're in a state where you know the secret key for the hive identity that's at the root of this next layer of truth, this next truth, right? So that's indicated by green. Green means you know that secret. So this is the state you're in when you want to puncture ID with this next witness. Okay, so the first thing you do is you find the node that corresponds to ID plus C. Right? So now you have ID star, and then you have ID star plus C. You want to somehow puncture. So okay, you find the path that leads from one to the next, from ID star to ID star plus C. You derive the secret keys down this path. And then you derive the keys for any sibling nodes on this path, right? So the co-paths, so to speak. And finally, you just delete the secret keys on the path itself. Whatever's left, you collect into a set of secret keys, and that's called the punctured secret key. So it's actually a collection of secret keys for different BT identities. Okay, so let's sanity check. Did we achieve our 3 goals? The first thing is, with this punctured key, can you still decrypt the ID star plus C? Well, no, you can't. Because you don't have that secret key, nor do you have the secret key for any identity that's an ancestor of it, which you can use to derive. So you cannot decrypt the ID star plus C. So using this to distribute R is indeed forward secret once it's been punctured. So far, so good. Can we continue this process into the next deployment next? In other words, can we derive any descending keys for ID star plus C? Yes, we can. Because we also have the secret key at the root of that next tree, that next layer. So from there, we can derive any leaf we have. Okay, good. So it's correct the protocol, right? We can actually go to the next deployment. And finally, can we derive any of the siblings? This is the port resilient part, right? If you get a different R prime, it'll be for a different challenge, and that'll correspond to one of the other leaves in this tree, the depth deepest point. And yes, you can. You can derive any one of those other leaves. Why? Well, because either you have them already, just like the left sibling of ID star plus C, or you have at least some secret key that's on the path that leads one of their ancestors, for the right two. So that's it. It ticks all our boxes. And that's what we can use for our protocol. So I encourage you to look at the full version. There you'll find another implicit primitive construction, the puncturable hive identity analog signatures. You'll find something we call a Peblin wrapper. That's like sort of a small protocol that we can wrap around any generic FRC GPA that exposes very simple language to applications that they can use to resolve forks when they have a reason about the fork and how to resolve it. Obviously, all the construction details, security proofs, and definitions.
Thank you, Joel. Do we have any question? Joel.
Hi, have you taken a stab at implementing this?
No. We have benchmarks, but only for simulations, and not much.
Do you have a gut instinct on which part of this is mysteries?
Very, very little, because the only real difference on the last is this PPRL part. So, okay, I'm talking about freak now. No freak is the high productive. That's not that's like super, that's very deep high. It's that you don't have very efficient. That's not going to compare to anything. Okay. But the freak, the only real delta is the PPRL, which in practice you would do with a GGM sort of tree, and that's just a couple of HK references. In fact, MOS already does that for the secret tree. So not a lot of it, milliseconds.
Yeah, we're a bit tight with time, so thank you so much, Joel, again.
testing.
Right, our next speaker is Daniel Collins, and he's going to tell us about active attack detection in messaging with immediate decryption.
What about now? Sorry about that. Yeah. Cool, good. So the double ratchet offers forward security and post-compromise security. There was talk about this in the last talk, but talk is fairly independent of these properties. So one nice thing about the double ratchet is this immediate decryption property. So in general, if Alice sends sort of several messages to some Bob, then that Bob doesn't have to receive all of the messages in the same order they were sent in. And some of the messages can be dropped, and this can be useful. So firstly, this can be useful in sort of demanding settings, like say if you're in a mesh network setting, or just in general with sort of something as big as the internet. And this could also be used for performance if you don't want to deliver all messages, say you have some big message that you want to buffer. This is something that's been considered recently in the two-party literature in terms of constructing sort of protocols that sort of kind of more, say, forward secure, post-compromise secure, or have trade-offs with the double ratchet. Also in MLS, you have this sort of symmetric sort of layer. Basically, MLS has symmetric encryption, and this also offers immediate decryption. So here's a quick example of what immediate decryption looks like. We have Alice and Bob. Bob is receiving sort of messages out of order, and one of them is being good. So in sort of an adversarial setting, a party state or essentially can be compromised. So at that point, let's say Alice is compromised, the adversary can act on behalf of Alice. And so in the worst case, this can result in sort of the entire sort of Alice basically taking over the adversary taking over Alice for basically the rest of the time. So in this diagram, we see Alice is trying to send messages, but sort of the adversary is sort of sending and receiving messages of Bob instead. And in the absence of any sort of notwithstanding sort of context, that in the absence of any additional cryptographic sort of mechanism, there's no real way to distinguish between the setting where this is Alice and where this is the adversary. So this motivates sort of asking the question, can we possibly detect or overcome such attacks? So there are two broad sort of things we can do. The first, so in the worst case, we know that it's not possible because the adversary can just keep impersonating some party. But in the sort of an interesting thing to look at is that if sort of an honest message is able to still get through after the impersonation has sort of happened, then in general, it is indeed possible to detect attacks. Sort of this is what we call the in-band setting, and this is the main focus of the talk. The full version, we also look at the out-of-band setting. And the out-of-band setting, which I just mentioned, sort of deals with this worst-case setting. So you can imagine you have some narrowband channel, like QR codes that you can pair with some party, or I don't know, you can combine several channels together or something to make your sort of, you assume authentication for free, and so the adversary, the active attack is not possible. Good. So in the sort of what has been done in this for this active attack detection, so it's been looked at in the in-order setting mainly, so when messages are delivered in the same order that they were sent in. So firstly, we have this R-recover notion introduced by direct coordinate. And the idea here is that, let's say Alice is compromised, and then the adversary is sending a message to Bob using the state that they have. So the guarantee that we want here is that after this compromise, any honest message that then gets sent to Bob will essentially be rejected. So I'd note here that in this talk, we basically, the mechanism that we kind of consider is basically the communication is no longer possible after the compromise, after sort of the compromise happens, like the honest communication. And actually dealing with this sort of is to some extent more of an application question, but a very interesting one for us. So this is the R-recover setting. And then in the dual setting, which is the S recover setting introduced slightly later, what happens now is that Bob is receiving the forgery, and then Bob, let's say sometime later, sends a message to Alice. So the idea here is that Alice, basically because Alice knows what she's been sending to Bob, Alice can basically tell that Bob has now received a forgery. And so Alice can therefore stop the communication. So somehow you want both of these things to sort of fully, deal with active attacks. So what's our contribution? So as I hinted, the in-order setting was considered in these previous two notions. So the first thing we look at is the recover definitions. And so the out-of-order setting. So that's what we do. So we define some appropriate security notions. So we then sort of propose a first construction that satisfies both of our requirements. So we'll talk a little about how we do that. We then sort of compare the two notions and sort of, but firstly, we see that there's sort of an inherent limitation with the first notion, and that is that there's essentially a linear communication overhead basically if you want this first notion, our recover notion for free. And this is essentially due to the out-of-order communication specifically. We then sort of deal more with the second notion, which we firstly showed can be achieved much more efficiently than the first notion. We propose some additional optimizations. And we also sort of briefly argue that sort of somehow if this is sort of a delay, provides delayed RID guarantees. And then of course in the full version, we deal with the out-of-band stuff, which broadly the techniques are similar, but we don't go into detail. Good, so let's fix some notation. So firstly, we consider a messaging primitive between two parties. I guess the takeaway from this slide is that sort of when parties are sending and receiving messages, the send and receive algorithms output some kind of index or some kind of ordinal. And basically what these ordinals of the form num correspond to is sort of the ordering of the messages relative to each other. So for example, for received messages, this is important because if it's a forgery, we don't know, it needs to have some kind of order. But in general, we use these to define security. And so we assume that they're totally ordered. So one example is in the double ratchet, this formalism from ACD 19. What it does basically is it defines epochs and indices. So an index is an indice is sort of in a given epoch, let's say how many messages have been sent in a row by one party, and then basically epochs increase as sort of messages are acknowledged by different parties in sort of a ping-pong sort of acknowledgement fashion. Good. So we then look at that recover with immediate decryption notions. So so we of course generalize the previous work for the setting. So in our notions, I guess I'd like to sort of emphasize that the adversary is essentially free to expose the state and the randomness of other parties arbitrarily. So our guarantees are basically with respect to a sort of an all-powerful adversary, which is of course stronger than what you can get with forward and post-compromise security. So yeah. So the first one is this sort of R recover notion. So what can we guarantee now? So of course, the main difference is that we don't have messages that are in order anymore. But what we can guarantee is that, let's say Bob receives some forgery. So now we have ordinals of messages. So let's say Bob, and ordinals are indices, let's say. So Bob receives a forgery for message 5. So what we want to guarantee is that sort of messages, all messages that are sort of received after, basically with larger ordinals, all messages that basically are attempted to be received with larger ordinals never actually get through to Bob. So here in this example, a message, because of out-of-order communication with a lower ordinal may be received, but then if we want something with an ordinal, say 7, to be rejected. And then for the sort of dual setting, where again we have our Bob receiving a forgery, Bob then sending sort of a message to Alice, and then Alice hopefully deducing that Bob received a forgery. So we want to guarantee here is basically that after Bob received the forgery messages that are then sent are rejected by Alice. So in our formalism in particular, the case here that I've just put on the board is allowed, where sort of a message sent before the forgery was received by Bob is able to get through to Alice. An application may not want to do this, but this is what the notion guarantees. Good. So how do we achieve recover security in this setting? So we assume we build somehow a compiler that takes any sort of messaging scheme and then sort of attaches software. So what we do is that we let the sending party basically, or both parties, keep track of all messages that they've sent and received. And sort of whenever a party sends a message, what they'll do is that they'll attach all messages that they've sent and received to the ciphertext. And so the idea here is then, like, when a party receives such a message, they can look at the whole message, all the messages that the party claims to have sent and received, and basically check for any contradictions between what they know and what they've received. And so intuitively, as we'll see, we get R recover security from attaching sent messages, and S recover from attaching the received messages. Yeah. So, and when I say messages here, basically I'm referring to ciphertexts and sort of the corresponding ordinals and just also associated data, which we can mostly ignore. One has to be a little careful in actually doing it because the adversary can try and sort of inject messages that kind of try and bypass the checks. But the basic idea is as follows. So for our recover security, let's consider this example where the adversary, Alice is sending, say, 5 messages to Bob in a row. Let's say all but the last one has been dropped. But firstly, let's assume that Bob has received a forgery for the 4th message from the adversary. So, okay, so then Alice is sending a message. Alice, as we just described, sends her list of sent messages to Bob. And so what Bob will do is then when Bob receives message 5, the real message 5, Bob will basically check that list of sent messages, which contains messages 1 to 4, and basically will check and basically realize that the 4th message that Alice sent does not correspond to the 4th message that Bob received. And so due to this, Bob will be able to output the bottom value, reject the message. Good. And then in this sort of dual setting, the S recovered case, here now we have, Bob, once again, receiving a forgery and then sending a message after that to Alice. So let's say Bob has received a forgery for message 4, sends a message to Alice. So Alice, of course, knows what Alice sent. Alice did not send the message 4 that Bob claims to have received. So when Alice learns this information from Bob, basically Alice can compare this to the messages that Alice has sent herself, which she only needs to store in state, and basically can reject the forgery. Okay, so a fairly expensive construction at first glance, and indeed, it turns out for this R recover notion that it is somehow unavoidable. So what's the intuition for this? So the high level intuition is that if you have, let's say, Alice sending n messages in a row, you basically need to make sure that if Bob receives the nth message, and then Bob tries to receive forgeries for any of the previous messages, that these forgeries, due to the security requirement of our recover security, should be rejected. So informally, we can sort of we can define some kind of encoder-decoder, the pair that basically where the decoder will kind of extract these messages, given the nth ciphertext. So informally, here's sort of the lower bound statement that we have. So let's say Alice sends n messages, each of length n, or most length n. And then sort of the guarantee is that the ciphertext space will go exponentially, and firstly the size of the message, but also linearly in both the security parameter and also the number of messages sent. Okay, so what's an intuition for the proof? So like I said, we sort of make somehow an information theoretic argument, and use the recover security notion. So we consider an encoder-decoder. So we have Alice and Bob. So the encoder and decoder, sorry, and the encoder and decoder both take Alice and Bob's initial states, let's say, as input. And so what the encoder will do is basically, so the encoder will take the first m messages as input. And then what the encoder will do is basically on Alice's state, run the send algorithm. And then it'll, for the first n messages, and then because sending is stateful, it'll update the state every time. Then you'll end up with the nth message, or the nth ciphertext for which the encoder outputs. And then for the decoder, we kind of have the opposite. So we have the ciphertext, which is input. This is the nth ciphertext. So what happens then is that firstly, the encoder will input that to Bob, and so Bob receives that. Then what the decoder will do is sort of exhaust all possible ciphertexts. And sort of intuitively, what we have, and so what we have there is that the only ciphertexts that are not rejected by Bob are the ones that were actually the real honest messages, because the recover security notion guarantees that this guarantees this. Good. So how do we, despite having this lower bounds, is there still hope of practical active attack detection in bound? So the first thing we note is that sort of this dual S notion somehow provides delayed R recover guarantees. And the reason is somehow as follows. So let's say Alice, Bob once again receives a forgery. Bob will then send some ciphertext to Alice at some point. And so what the recover security should guarantee is that Alice outputs Bob when Alice receives the honest message. What Alice can do at that point is then send some kind of abort message to Bob. And then if you allow this honest round of communication, eventually Bob can learn that indeed the communication should be aborted and you can break down the channel. So okay, so how efficiently can we build this? So we recall that our construction for getting S recover security was to attach all received messages to each ciphertext. So the first thing to note is that sort of instead of actually sending a linear number of sort of ciphertexts and a linear number of indices, what you can instead do is just send a hash of all of this entire set, plus sort of just the indices separately. And sort of the guarantee and the reason this works is let's say Alice is doing this, Bob, who is basically knows what Bob sent before, can essentially recompute this hash and just sort of using the indices that was given as input, and then sort of do the hash comparison. And this somehow is equivalent to having sent the whole thing. And in practice, this can be nice because the indices can be much more efficient than sort of the size of like the security parameter, let's say, especially if you have like in-order communication. You can also do better because this hash computation. One thing you can do is use something called an incremental hash function, which allows you to sort of incrementally compute. So if you want to add like one additional element, like if you want to consider a set R prime, which has one more element than R, the hash of that basically takes time proportional to the one rather than sort of the size of the set. And so asymptotically, at least, this is more efficient. There's another very nice optimization that was actually proposed by a reviewer. So what we can do here at a very high level is to basically prune messages. So as we saw before, the size of this R set, this received messages grows basically unboundedly. So what we actually need to do only is send this for sort of a relatively short period of time. And how long that is corresponds to sort of these epochs. And these epochs are not these CGP epochs, but these signal epochs, which I hinted at before. So the basic idea of these epochs, just to quickly define it, is that sort of when Alice is, so Alice is in epoch E when she is sending, let's say, and then Bob is in epoch E plus 1. So when Alice receives a message in epoch E plus 2, Alice receives a message from Bob from epoch E plus 1, she'll then move to epoch E plus 2. So in general, Alice can send many messages in an epoch, receive a message, and then move to the new epoch once the acknowledged message has been made. Good. So the optimization essentially boils down to the fact that for a given epoch, you only need to send like a specific part of this, like you only need to send like a part of a set just for the one epoch. So basically what we do is we can sort of break the receive set down into two types of messages, the sort of the core receive messages, let's say, and this R prime set. And so this R prime set will grow as you receive more messages in an epoch. And basically we show that sort of if you assume honest delivery, then because you only advance epochs, like every time you receive something from the next epoch, then you'll always know the full like state of the received messages. And then we show in the paper that otherwise the forgery is going to be detected. So here's a quick sort of visual indication of this. So Alice is sending some sort of R core and R prime set. That R prime set may be growing. Then when Alice receives a response from Bob, Alice will then refresh the set. Good. So in this talk, we basically looked at active attacks. So particularly because this S recover notion was more efficient and efficient to the point, and in practice messages, you only may send a few messages for each sort of epoch. We consider it practical. Our countermeasure to be practical. But future work could look at sort of additional stuff like the group setting. So firstly, you could look at sort of defining sort of, let's say optimal security notions like for recover, and then basically trying to optimize to make it more efficient, like what we did for S recover. And then, of course, to see how well this actually fares in practice is additional. Good. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any questions for Daniel? So I have a question. When you, I think I got confused about something about the lower bound. So you mentioned there's a lower bound. We have to send at least n elements.
Mhm.
But then, and the first thing that I thought, I was like, wait, why wouldn't you just hash? But then you later you say, well, you can hash, and then you don't need to send n elements, but you still need to send n indices.
Ah,
My question is, why would you need to send n indices?
okay, yeah, so I guess, so firstly, I wasn't clear, there are two separate security notions that we consider. And so what we show is that for sort of one of the security notions, the size of the ciphertext must grow linearly. And this is not just with respect to the number of messages, but also with the security graph. So intuitively, you have to send like n hashes. But then what we show is that we have sort of, let's say, a weaker notion that we look at. And for this notion, it suffices to send like one cryptographic element and just like a sequence of indices. And moreover, what we show also for this is that we can sort of croon the state, like as the communication goes.
Again, why would you need indices? Because the hash, in order to be recomputed,
Yeah.
You need the knowledge of indices, right?
Yeah. So the lower bound does not apply to the second optimization. So the idea here is that like the indices basically help the receiver of the message recompute the hash.
And you cannot get rid of them.
So it's not, I mean, maybe there's some kind of communication complexity lower bound. You can prove that you need something like this, but we didn't prove anything about whether you need such indices. So.
There are no more questions. Thank you, Daniel, again. Thank you for all the people.